So um, I'm going to do something a little different this week. I guess it's not too different. Well, it is different. Um, I'm going to be not talking so much about a book, but I'm going to be talking about the table of contents of a book because this book is pretty intense and involved. But I titled my sermon today, Permission to Feel, not based on the table of contents of the book I'm going to be talking about, but based on the title of a different book, based on the title of the book Permission to Feel by Dr. Mark Brackett, who is the director at the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence. And I was listening to his audiobook today in relation to working with children and youth and families about the importance of emotions. And I came across a interview from Brene Brown, who her latest book is Atlas of the Heart. And she had such a great term. She called it the need for us to understand emotional nuance. And so combining what Dr. Brackett was talking about with understanding how to feel and giving ourselves permission to feel our emotions with what Brene Brown has been talking about for the last year or so with understanding the nuance of emotions, I thought we would end up with an interesting sermon today. So the table of contents for Dr. Mark Brackett's book, he talks about when it comes to emotions, he uses the ruler analogy. R stands for recognize, U stands for understand, and this is in relation to emotion. So R is recognize your emotion, U is understand your emotion, L stands for labeling emotions, E is expressing emotions, and R is regulating emotions. So the ruler, do we, when we're going through something, can we recognize what we're feeling? Can we understand it? Do we have a label or a word for it? Are we able and allowed to express it? And then when it's moving through our body and we're having all types of feelings, do we know how to regulate them? And so in this interview that I saw with Brene Brown, I realized what she is doing such a great job in her book is talking about the L part, the labeling of emotions. And she, for those of you who don't know Brene, she's a researcher, and she somehow is able to research kind of esoteric, non-tangible things and make them make sense. And so when she started her research, she asked thousands of people to name the emotions that they most identify with. And she thought that maybe there would be 6 or 7 that would come out. There were only 3. For the most part, people knew how to recognize if they were happy, sad, or angry. 3. And so her book goes into depth of 87 emotions. And what she says is, she says, we started our research asking how many emotions can we recognize in ourselves as we are feeling them. I assumed the answer would be maybe 6 or 7, but it was just happy, sad, and mad. And it was so alarming because when we don't have language that's as expansive as our actual experiences, we force our experiences into language, And that's troublesome because language does much more than communicate what we are feeling. It actually shapes what we are feeling. So I'm going to say that again. She says, when we don't have language that is as expansive as our experiences, we force our experiences into language. And when we name, she goes on to say, when we name what we are feeling, it doesn't have power over us anymore. We gain power. There's strong evidence that shows the ability to accurately name and recognize emotions. We call it emotional granularity. Really leads to the ability to manage it and move through it. The language we use changes the experience. And I want us to just sit with that for a minute or two, because what she's saying is really so very important. A few months ago, I gave a sermon about emotional contagion, in which we talked about how easily we can take on the emotions of the people around us without even realizing it, and how once that happens, for the most part, we're able to be easily manipulated by the media, by politicians, or whoever else has figured out how to play into our emotional vulnerability. And what I think both Brene Brown and Mark Brackett are doing is giving us the language and the ability to not get sucked into what I call mass hypnotic thinking. If we are able to be in control of our emotions and the language around the emotions, then we have the ability to express what we are feeling, and it gives us more power. And so what I want to do today, for the most part, is to take a little bit of time for us to interact a little bit with what Brown calls the nuance of emotions. And I just find it so interesting that most of us don't even realize that there is nuance in all of this. So what I'm going to do today is I am going to read the table of contents of a book for all of you, but I want us to just, my invitation is to really take in and explore within yourselves how your life might become more expansive if you take the time when you're going through whatever is happening in your life to ask yourself, am I feeling something more than just happy, sad, or angry? And so her book starts with places we go when things are uncertain or too much. So when we are feeling uncertain, we may feel overwhelmed, stress, anxiety, worry, avoidance, excitement, dread, fear, or vulnerability. There's a difference that she explores in this book between dread and fear. There's a difference between anxiety and worry. Chapter 2 is places we go when we compare. So when we're comparing ourselves, we have comparison, but then within that we have admiration, reverence, envy, jealousy, resentment, Schadenfreude, Schadenfreude, and Freudenfreude. And I love these. Does anybody know what Schadenfreude is? Janet's raising her hand, Steve's raising his hand. Schadenfreude is when you get just a little bit of joy or happiness when something is going wrong for somebody else. There's actually a word for that. It's called Schadenfreude. But Freudenfreude is the opposite. It is the joy or the happiness that you get when you see something going well for somebody else. Right? So we can see something happening for somebody and we may think, oh, I'm a bad person, I'm jealous or I'm envious. Well, there's a difference between envy, there's a difference between jealousy, and we might not be envious or jealous at all. We might be feeling some Freudenfreude. We might actually be happy for this other person and we just haven't had the language for it. Places we go when things don't go as planned. We usually think, okay, well, maybe I'm disappointed. And that's one emotion, but then there's also expectations, regret, discouragement, resignation, frustration, or boredom. So instead of just saying, I'm disappointed, well, are you disappointed, or is it that you actually had an expectation that wasn't met, that you hadn't articulated or you weren't even aware of? Are you disappointed, or are you just feeling the regret that something didn't happen the way that you wanted it to happen? Are you disappointed, or is it a bit of resignation where underneath the disappointment is a sense of powerlessness? Do you see how these nuances really, really matter? And then she says, places we go when it's beyond us. Awe, wonder, confusion, curiosity, interest, surprise. How many of us have really taken the time to contemplate the difference between awe and wonder? Or wonder and curiosity? Do you see how giving language to something and really taking the time to look at the nuances, at least for me, I feel like it is expanding how I can interact in the world. Places we go when things aren't what they seem. Amusement, bittersweetness, nostalgia, cognitive dissonance, paradox, irony, sarcasm. So what's the difference between nostalgia and a sense of feeling bittersweet? There's a difference there. What's the difference between paradox and irony? And can we articulate that? When we're hurt, we might go into anguish, hopelessness, despair, sadness, or grief. And I know as a chaplain, a lot of times when I'm doing pastoral care, I'm pretty good over the years at, somebody will come and talk to me about something and I'll say, oh, have you thought that perhaps you're grieving and you just don't realize it and it's coming out as anger or fear? And people sometimes are like, oh, yeah, I hadn't realized I was grieving. But see, what I hadn't realized is that my go-to was just grief. But what I'm learning is that it could also be anguish, it could be hopelessness, it could be despair, it could be sadness. And what are the differences between that? Not just grief. Places we go with others, we see this a lot. Compassion, pity, empathy, sympathy, boundaries, comparative suffering. So what's the difference between empathy and sympathy? What's the difference between pity and compassion? And she talks about the close, the near enemies and the far enemies. And an enemy of compassion, we understand, okay, the difference between the opposite of compassion is hate. But what she talks about, but the near enemy of compassion is pity. So compassion is a sense of empathy with love, and pity is oh, you poor thing. And somebody may be pretending or thinking that they're being nice, but when they're pitying you, you don't necessarily feel good about it. And that's called the near friend, that it can look similar, but it's really not, and it doesn't feel the same at all. And then places we go when we fall short: shame, self-compassion, perfectionism, guilt, humiliation, and embarrassment. Am I feeling embarrassed right now, or am I feeling humiliated? And what is the difference, and why does it leave with a different feeling? What are the differences? Places we go when we search for connection: belonging, fitting in, connection, disconnection, insecurity, invisibility, loneliness. Is belonging the same thing as actually fitting in? Is disconnection the same thing as feeling invisible? And is feeling invisible the same thing as feeling lonely? We just know, I just don't feel like I belong here. I feel disconnected. But 3 people may say, I just don't feel like I belong here, but it's because one person might be feeling invisible. One person might just be feeling lonely, and one person might just be feeling insecure. It looks the same, and yet it's not. And so if we aren't taking the time to really think about what's going on with us, maybe we're feeling disconnected because we feel insecure, but no, it's not actually that. It's that I just feel invisible with this group of people. 2 very different things. Places we go when the heart is open: love, lovelessness, heartbreak, trust, self-trust, betrayal, defensiveness, flooding, and hurt. We tend to think, or at least I do, that when we have an open heart, everything is going to be great. An open heart means joy and compassion and friendship and all of these higher vibrational emotions. But in fact, with an open heart, we can get hurt, we can have heartbreak, we can get betrayed. Is that perhaps why we're scared to open our heart? Because there's a fear of betrayal, and we haven't acknowledged that within ourselves. Places we go when life is good: joy, happiness, calm, contentment, gratitude, foreboding joy, relief, tranquility. Foreboding joy. How many of us think sometimes about our life and, oh, well, everything is good, but I just know that other shoe is going to drop. I can't ever relax. I'm always anxious because if my life is good, that means that eventually something bad has to happen. Well, there's actually a name for that. It's called foreboding joy. If we can recognize that, then we have language for that, then we have power over that fear. And we can either say, okay, I'm acknowledging this right now, or I'm going to let it go. And then places we go when we feel wronged: anger, contempt, disgust, dehumanization, hate, and self-righteousness. When I was reading through this today, thinking, can I possibly get away with a sermon based on a table of contents? Number 12 is the last chapter, but I'm going to read this again. Anger, contempt, disgust, dehumanization, hate, and self-righteousness. Where has our country been in the last few years? Where have we been getting sucked into when we turn on the media or we look at the trucks going up and down North Avenue with their flags that are not very loving? How have we been talking to our neighbors and our friends, or how have we been talking about our neighbors and our friends? And when we go on social media, how do we talk about the other or realize this person just called me a snowflake? I think they're referring to me because or whatever. It took me about 10 minutes. I timed myself this morning. It took me about 10 minutes to read all of these emotions. That is how much nuance and expressiveness can be found and felt within each one of us. And yet, one chapter, the 12th chapter, is where most of our country has been for the last 5 or 6 years. And I don't necessarily know what to do with that, but that was kind of an aha moment for me. And so it's easy for us to other people and say, oh, that's just them. They're filled with anger and hate and contempt and all of that. But my question is for all of us today, where are we in that list? Because I realized for myself, I think the aha moment wasn't about what's going on with all of you or out there, but with me. Oh my gosh, I have allowed myself to be manipulated into those lower emotions, the anger, the hate, the contempt. I can't even name them all. When there were 10 minutes of other things that I could be and should be and probably was feeling but didn't have language for. And so I just find it so interesting that I could get that much out of just a table of contents. And this book, we use it for our chaplains, and it feels like a textbook because there's so much in it. But there's a lot of transformational understanding, I think, in taking the time to be able to express and articulate these nuances. And so I'm going to invite us to do a little, I don't know how this is going to go. Maybe I'll just let us think about it. But one of the things we do in the chaplaincy class is we do a little exercise with helping the chaplain interns figure out what emotion might be going on with somebody. And I saw this, I pulled it up yesterday, and I realized that a lot of the emotions that I had answered these questions with, there are about 4 or 5. And I'm going to have to go through this again with an option of 87. But I'll just give a few scenarios that we can, maybe we can, I'll throw out the scenario, and then maybe as a group, if you're on Zoom, you can like type in what some of the emotions might be, or you can like popcorn them out. So a 27-year-old man is distressed because he yelled at his mother when she nagged him. She kept nagging at me until I finally began screaming at her. I don't know what happened. All right, what's going on with him? What are those emotions? Fear. Fear? Resentment? What did you say? Belittlement. Belittlement. Humiliation. Frustration. Anger. Shame. Looks like Alicia said frustration. So those were the ones that I had a few years ago: shame, frustration, anger, and resentment. All right, a 64-year-old person has been told they have terminal cancer and says, why me? Abandonment. Confusion. Fear. Victimized. I think I also wrote anger. Oh, a little bit of anger. Surprise. I had shock. Hopeless. Hate of self and a spirit who failed her is what Alicia said to everybody. Bucket list. Bucket list. Right. Maybe, you know, I don't get to finish this bucket list, or I'm going to create a bucket list. All right. A 30-year-old woman says, my best friend has turned her back on me, and I don't know why. Confusion. Abandonment. Sadness. Betrayal. Fear. Confusion. Vulnerability. Grief. Shame. Anger. All right, a 54-year-old person says, they're asking me to do things at work that aren't right. If I complain, I could lose my job. Untrustworthy, frustration, fear. What did you say, Bruce? Integrity. Integrity, character, resentment, self-loathing, humiliation, hatred, powerlessness, fear. I don't know if somebody said that yet. Indignation, stress, paranoia. All right. And what I realized when I'm looking at what I had, I was using about the same 4. I was using powerlessness, anger, shame, and fear a lot in this. All right, a 17-year-old woman is in an alternative school and won't answer any questions. She finally says, I don't know what I'm doing here. Indifference. Rebellion. Isolation. Loneliness. Fear. Detached. Alicia says confusion, mistrust, anger, vulnerability. A 39-year-old bachelor says, I've finally met a woman who is very genuine and lets me be myself. I care about her and she cares about me. I never thought this would happen. Surprise. Relief. Joy. Content. Anxiety. Foreboding joy. That's a new one, right? Awe. Wonder. Delight. That's a new one. Contentment. Gratitude. Self-protection or guarding. All right. A first-year engineer graduate student has been having a difficult time at school. I just don't have much enthusiasm. I know I could do better if I wanted to, but I don't seem to care. Detachment, apathy, malaise, depression, hopelessness, overwhelm, frustration, disconnect, tired, anxious. And then finally, a 72-year-old parent says, my 45-year-old daughter has never been able to get her act together. I don't know what she's gonna do when I'm gone. Despair, worry, concern, frustration, anger, self-doubt, superior, sadness. I don't know if frustration was said, or pity, or resentment, self-righteousness, hopelessness. All right, well, I just wanted to walk us through a little bit of this today, because I think it's so important. My focus really for the last few years has been, what's going on? How do we make a difference? How do we make change? How do we change ourselves? And once again, I think this is just one more spoke on that wheel that I talked about with the kids today, for us and for our kids, that if we are going through our lives, myself included, really only having the emotional language to be able to articulate 3 to 5 emotions, we are probably not going to be feeling really fulfilled and happy and all of these other words that I now don't have in my head. But we have to think about giving ourselves the opportunity and the ability to expand our language so that we can expand our emotions, so that we can expand our life experience. And so hopefully me standing up here and reading a table of content was at least a little bit meaningful to some of you today. And so with that, one of my favorite emotions is love. And let us sing our closing hymn this morning, Love Will Guide Us.
Love will guide us, peace has tried.